Right. Welcome everybody to this week's WIN meeting. I'm chairing the meeting this week, and I've just now can't say what was in the introduction, but basically Matthew's come along to talk about the crisis in the energy sector. As everybody knows, we're facing an absolute nightmare of bills this year. Rising gas prices are going to put up the cost of absolutely everything, and it's very difficult to see how bad things are going to get, really. Anyway, I'll stop and I'll let Matthew speak. How long do you want to speak for, Matthew?
Well, give about 20 minutes. The problem is it's quite complicated, so I'll try and get through as much as possible.
Okay, thank you.
And if anybody wants to ask any further questions, can supply any further material. Can I just, if you want me to start, I shall share my screen, if that's okay.
Do we have to put you on? I'll make you a co-host.
I've got share screen on here. I don't know if that works, but
see if it works. I think it does, actually.
It does. Okay.
I think.
Okay. Oh no, it says host disabled participant share screen. You'll need to enable it.
Hold on, I'll make you a. Where are you?
Just because if I put up a sort of few illustrations, it actually makes it a lot easier to explain.
You're a co-host now, so you should.
Okay, great stuff. Thanks. Right. Okay. Thanks, comrades, and thanks for the opportunity to present this. I'll just say, obviously, we're facing a major crisis in energy. I mean, specifically electricity and gas. As a result of a number of underlying factors, and then exaggerated by the war and the efforts at sanctions and so on, which is affecting the world. But I mean, obviously, specifically, I'm going to deal with Europe. I want to cover electricity and gas and not go through the likes of oil and so on and so forth, because that's not the sector I work in. I've actually worked in the utility sector for more than 20 years, covering virtually the entire period of what they call the process of deregulation, which is a very strange method applied by the British to introduce markets and so on into the operation of the sector, and which was actually adopted by the rest of Europe. Actually, the EU, of course, was decided in favour of privatisation and so on, and marketisation of the energy of the sector, and so they effectively the rest of Europe copied Britain. So Britain was first, and everybody else went slightly later, and of course, all the structures are slightly different. Anyway, so I'll just show you this nice illustration. I hope this lovely map here covers the, obviously as a result of say war and so on, and the impact. This map actually covers what it shows as gas infrastructure in Europe, which is what's been affected, and that's the critical point. I think there's various factors in here for this one. First of all, obviously, you've got you can see the infrastructure around the North Sea. Centrally, obviously, the development of the North Sea as a gas producer has been pretty major in terms of production, particularly for Britain, but also for all the North Sea bordering countries. The other part, of course, of this original sort of central point of gas production is actually in the Netherlands. And the Netherlands had a very large gas field called Groningen, which essentially was what you would call a swing provider. It set prices because essentially they could turn it all on and off, and it actually had a huge impact in terms of price for most of Europe. In Britain, there was another swing field called Barrow. But what has happened in the last period, in the last 10 years or so, has been rundown of all that old infrastructure that comes, coming from those countries, around the North Sea, and then the reliance on Europe. Europe now relies on three major gas producers. One is Norway, and you'll see the pipelines coming out of Norway, and this is where most of the import gas for Britain comes from. Is not through the Norwegian pipelines. So it doesn't actually. The second is Russia, as you can see in the east. You can see all the pipes running from Russia. Particularly note, if you look at the Baltic Sea, you can see the Nord Stream 1 and 2 running down the middle of it, which was part of the whole debate discussion at the start of this whole process. And Russia essentially provides a whole lot of gas to a series of, most of Central Europe, particularly Germany, but also, you can look at, Ukraine, Hungary, Italy, all these countries depend on Russian gas. There is a third supplier. If you look down at the bottom here, you've got quite a major supplier in Algeria. So effectively, Europe is surrounded by three major gas suppliers. Algerian infrastructure is the least developed, and only a small number of pipelines coming out of Algeria. So that resource has not been developed. So effectively, meaning that the important producer is Russia as the largest supplier. Effectively, what you had, if people remember the process of détente over decades with the USSR, the basis of détente materially actually was a deal between the Germans and the Russians to supply gas, and particularly to the German SPD, starting with Willy Brandt in the late 60s and early 70s, and the development of that infrastructure running from Russia, and actually a lot of the pipeline itself and the assorted material was supplied by Germany in order to supply itself gas. So the SPD as a political and organisation and so on, and material organisation, which obviously is rooted into industry in Germany and so on, particularly, also has very strong connections to the German gas industry. To the Russian gas exporting companies, and actually people like particularly obviously Gerhard Schröder, as ex-chancellor of Germany, was on the board of Nord Stream 2 until recently, when the whole thing blew up and he was forced off. It was very much a joint thing between the two countries, and very much rooted in the SPD. So you've seen actually the most aggressive people in terms of prosecuting sanctions and so on and so forth has not been the SPD, it's actually been the Greens, surprisingly enough. For an outfit supposed to be in favour of environmentalism, they're very much in favour of war. So the problems you've got here is that at the same time, what was happening in terms of last year, if you look at last year, before all the war blew up, Europe also depends on gas storage. Europe has, you can see, on this map, there's you can see all the gas storage is marked. Europe has some quite large gas storage, which it uses obviously to try and smooth off prices and so on and so forth. Now, the problem in last year was, of course, the price of gas was actually still going up because the storage was pretty empty, and so they didn't have that buffer. Britain doesn't have any storage to note. Britain used to have storage, used to have one major storage field, but that basically ran out of it. It became effectively obsolete, and the owner of Centrica asked the government, said, do you want us to build more? And the government turned around and said, no, we don't need any of that. So Britain doesn't have any storage to note, and so is dependent on supply directly through pipe. Essentially then what you're looking at is a situation where gas effectively is important to most of the economy. And we've seen obviously in Britain and elsewhere the impact on say, fertilizer production, which is relies on methane in order to produce ammonia and so on and so forth. So it's central to a whole series of industries. And in fact, Germany is reliant for about 55 to 60% of its gas on Russia. So it's pretty central. In those terms, also the other problem with it is that it actually gas is central to the production of electricity, and I'll come on to this a bit later. In terms of the most important fuel for producing electricity is actually gas, because of the, not necessarily in volume, but in terms of its price impact. Because what happened, of course, is that when they designed the markets for electricity. So, I mean, obviously, moving from a situation where, in the old days, where essentially electricity was produced by the state, and there was a sort of notional market. But the whole process was controlled by the state. So you've looked at it sort of in the old days, that, say, in Britain, that there was a considerable control of North Sea production by the state. There was almost total control of coal production. So effectively, the state controlled everything from the coal cutting machine at one end, or the gas field at one end, down to the electricity or gas meter. And what the process of this deregulation or marketisation meant was to essentially pass all that out and to create markets, at which point profits could be made. One of these markets, obviously, was the market for a wholesale gas and electricity markets. The other point was obviously supply, and of course the two are intimately linked, but of course regulated quite differently. And of course what we're seeing now is the two are moving in opposite directions and creating enormous crisis. So if we look at if I go back to my other bits of what's happened, I shall go and share now. I think new share. So what's happened in recent times, I can close that one. Close that one, okay. In recent times, what's happened to gas prices is that gas prices have gone crazy. Historically, gas prices were, certainly in UK terms, were something like about 12 pence per therm, which is a British thermal unit. Energy tends to get traded in very odd units, like barrels, which are basically things that you stuck on the back of an American horse and cart, or what's called British, in gas terms, a British thermal unit, which is basically just an attempt to say, well, such and such volume of gas will have so and so calorific value and produce so and so much heat. So what's happened is that as I say, in the old days, it went from about 12 pence in summer to about 30 pence in winter, and it didn't change that much. With the marketisation, what it meant is that it's got a lot more volatile. So what has then happened is the price has been historically pretty high last year, in fact. And there was the talk of crisis in terms of the huge price increases that were going on in 2021 because of the shortage of supply coming out of the pandemic. There was both a bigger demand on the system because of the recovery in both Europe and particularly East Asia. And so the sort of tanker loads of liquid natural gas effectively were functioning as sort of instruments of speculation. So you could, if you were particularly sharp, you could load the tanker with liquid natural gas in somewhere like Qatar or the US or the other exporting countries, and you could essentially play a price game with it as it was on the sea. Instead of saying, I will deliver it to X point, I will wait, I will see where the price is highest. So actually what we did have was tankers turning around and saying, well, okay, the price is higher here. So instead of going to where we were going to go originally, we'll go somewhere else. So what is it? There was this sort of thing happening, and prices were being ratcheted up. So what then happens, of course, when the war happens, of course, is that there's a huge cutoff in terms of the reliance on Russian gas. The questions of Russia, will supply continue? Questions of sanctions, questions of who pays in what currency, etc., etc., etc. So gas actually goes to the point. I mean, at one point, I think in Britain it went to somewhere like £8 a therm, which was described to me as actually above this graph. I think it was one day it went to £8 a therm, which is described to me by one of the major consultancies as a notional price, i.e. there is gas and there is a market, but nobody can afford to pay for the stuff. So it gets really crazy. If we go back to the impact of that gas is then into electricity, and we can see this graph here shows the split across the European Union in terms of who uses what to generate electricity. As you can see, a lot of it is fossil fuel. A lot of that fossil fuel will be gas. So there's a direct link between the two. I mean, obviously you've got likes of Poland is generating mostly by coal. There is quite a bit of coal still on in Germany, particularly filthy brown coal, and then in some other countries. But the major countries, you can see it's the likes of Spain or the UK or so on. It's gas, and the thing is that this also is set by the sort of what they call a marginal pricing system, which is used in electricity wholesale markets.
Matthew, you've had 15 minutes so far.
Okay, all right. As I say, that this is equivalent for Britain. So you can see electricity generated by fuel. So essentially, that bit fossil fuel is effectively gas now. I mean, I think coal generates about 2% or less now. Occasionally they'll turn on a coal unit when there's nothing else. And I think there's only about 4 or 5 coal units left. So the problem with this is when you use a marginal pricing system, it's what happens is the last, essentially what happens is you have a certain request to supply for a given period, and it's every half an hour, and the last bid given will set the price for all the electricity supplied under that at that point for the prompt point, and so the actual market setter is usually the gas generation. So essentially, electricity has been forced up in lockstep with gas prices. So, and you can see, oh, sorry, I've done that one. Yeah, okay. So this has then created a huge crisis, because now electricity is now looking at, if you looked at electricity in Britain, normally it would be somewhere below £50 a megawatt, and it's now 5 times that. So you're looking at 250 quid a megawatt is the market price on wholesale, and the price of gas has gone from about, I mean, usually about, I think in recent terms, 40, 50 pence a therm to 3 quid and above a therm. Now, what's happened in those terms is there's, of course, the actual retail market for utilities, of course, is under conditions of a decaying capitalism, is political. The supply companies actually would love to say, and they do say on occasion, well, you should look at it in the same way as you look at buying a pint of milk in the supermarket and whatever else, and therefore we should be able to charge the price and there should be a competition and all the rest of it. However, as we know, that doesn't work like that. actually what you can probably look at utility companies more reasonably as government franchises. They're actually franchised by the state, essentially, is how they work. So they're constantly, because it's so central to obviously the functioning of both the economy and of life for the bulk of the population, they're subject to very tight regulation. And there's been an effort by the government of assorted countries, including particularly Britain and also France and so on, to hold down the price. In Britain, they instated what's called the price cap system. And the price cap system essentially works on the basis of a calculation done by the regulator over a period of time, which then generates a price over 6 months, which of course takes no recognition of what the actual price that the companies pay for wholesale power and gas. So what's happening at the moment is that the price cap has gone up to unprecedented levels at 2,000 quid, but for an average customer, £2,000 a year, but the actual wholesale cost level is in excess of 3,000 quid. So all of the supply has been bled dry. This was also done in France in particular, where obviously the French government has a very large, about 90% holding in EDF, which is I think the world's largest generating company, certainly the largest one in Europe. And in order, obviously, with the presidential election coming, they decided in order to hold down the price by destroying the balance sheet of EDF. What they did is they ordered EDF to offer cheap electricity to everybody in the market, well below the price that EDF would pay, and therefore removed, I think, 8.4 billion euros in one fell swoop from the balance sheet of EDF.
Which is now, Matthew.
Okay, that's effectively destroyed the company, but it means that the price increase has been held at 4% in France. However, so what you're seeing is a gross crisis in terms of supply, where all of the bosses of the major suppliers in Britain essentially went to Parliament last week and said, "Look, the whole thing wheels have come off. You have to do something now." Because we cannot do anything more. We can see that huge numbers of customers are not going to pay the price as it is now. We don't have the resource to do anything. That prices are only going to go up. And at the moment, we're looking at very, very gross losses. And I and my colleagues are currently in fear of mass sackings. Because that will be the response at the moment, is to get rid of huge chunks of the workforce. So it really is a major state. I mean, both in terms of the impact of war and sanctions, and also, of course, the impact on the working class in general, and the question of what demands do we put, which I think is obviously is the development to this discussion. I'm hoping that this, at least, what I've provided is at least a framework for that discussion. As I say, happy to answer any questions or provide any more data. I've got huge amounts of material that people can have.
Okay, thanks very much, Matthew. Do you want to on-screen share?
On-screen myself, yes.
I think that was very interesting, very informative. I mean, I didn't know most of that. Who would like to speak? You just put your electronic hand up if you want to speak. Can't see anybody at the moment.
Leslie said she would want to speak.
Oh, yeah, right, Leslie, go on. I can't see the hands for some reason. No, right, okay, yeah, Leslie.
Okay, Pam, thanks. I'll switch the video off if the sound connection is affected, but I'll leave it on for now. Yeah, a couple of points and a question really for Matthew, and thank you very much. It's really interesting. So I'll switch the video off now because my connection's not great. Bill Clinton said it's the economy, stupid. And I think the thing about this particular crisis is this actually going to be more fundamental than, Partygate is shredding a lot of Johnson's credibility, even with his own. And apparently a YouGov survey said that 74% of voters in a sample survey thought that the Tory government were really bad in handling the inflation. And obviously a massive part of that inflation is gas and electricity. And, we are getting stories already about, we know the massive impact of the previous round of austerity, which has never ended for a lot of people. I think that this is going to impact on, on certain sections of the population, particularly. And we've seen that women's health has massively declined, working class health, but in particular women's health has declined over the last 10 years, and life expectancy is stalled. And for women now, it's actually going backwards in the poorest areas. Now, women pensioners historically in the UK have got lower pensions than male pensioners. So they're going to be hit particularly hard by these fuel rises. You've got single parents who already have been robbed of £20 a week uplift of universal credit from the pandemic. And obviously, traditionally, women's wages have tended to be lower than men's. So that increase, and it was interesting that Matthew mentioned, EDF has put fuel up by 4% in France. EDF have put fuel up by 54% in the UK. I've got a different supplier, but my previously reasonable fuel bill has literally gone up by 100%, and obviously that's going to go further. So I think touching on some of the case for the sort of demands, if there was ever a case for renationalisation of oil and gas and those and all the other resources, I think this is really it. But also there's the massive haste. We need to really link this to climate change, because this government has basically sat on its hands while all the privatisation has gone on, and done sod all about renewable fuels, wind farms, sea, and so on. So although there has been some increase of that, I think the chart you showed, Matthew, was quite shocking when you look at solar power and the other sources of power, how low that is compared to fossil fuel use in many in many countries. So my question is, I heard a little while ago, just when the prices first started going up, there was an interview with a guy who was he's actually Iraqi by nationality. He'd been an Iraqi oil engineer who happened to marry a Norwegian, was a migrant. And he actually, almost by accident, got a job with the state, I think, when oil was being developed in Norway. And apparently he was quite instrumental in trying to put the scheme in place that Norway has, with the fund where the government gets a lot more money and a lot more benefit, whereas obviously in the UK, everything was just, denationalised and marketised. But I'd just be interested in if you've got a bit more detail on that, because apparently the fund is worth something like £80,000 per Norwegian citizen, which shows, that what was frittered away, if you like, with North Sea oil. But again, I think it really highlights the case why you actually need state intervention, and obviously it should be run democratically with input. And again, in the UK, terrible situation with housing. Most of our housing stock is old. A lot of the new stock is absolutely awful. I saw a couple on telly who were up in Scotland, I think they were in Scotland. They paid £500,000 for their house, and it wasn't adequately insulated because of the deregulation of building regulations. So even newer housing that's gone up has been totally inadequate, even privately bought, never mind social housing. So again, these are issues where we can put forward demand about what we need in housing, which again can create, decently paid, well paid, trained jobs with the future. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Felicity. I'll take Aman next, and then if there's no more questions straight away, Matthew might like to respond to that. Aman?
Yeah, I think the whole issue of energy, and I'm sure you probably all agree, it goes a little bit deeper than just the issue of gas. The whole idea of fossil fuels in contrast to non-fossil fuels is a source of export of capital, and it has been so for decades. One of the ways of actually exporting capital has been through the purchase of the fossil fuels and the relative cheapness of it in terms of provision of the whole work of the fossil fuels. In terms of the oil, the issue has been there for some time. So some sort of a balance was reached, especially with the OPEC and OPEC +1, and then later on with the role of the US. But with the issue of gas as another means is a slightly different. I just put in the chat the producers with regard to the amount of gas that is provided around the world. If you look at it with Russia around 24%, Iran around 17%, going down suddenly to values of single figures or small single digits. When you look at these kind of figures, you can see the issue is hugely political. And I think the idea of the prices of energy and not considering it from the point of view of the politics around the world would make it impossible to actually understand why the prices have gone up. One of the trade-offs of the issue of the role of Russia has been to gain points in this area to enable itself to have more of a say economically, especially across Europe. And one of the major, if you like, I suppose you could call it battles, has been with regard to the role that Russia will play with this amount of supply, and especially with the stranglehold that it would have on Europe, and the role that US wanted to have in giving a lower hand, if you like, to Russia. The balance between these, I think, it makes the point not just an economical issue in terms of the use, but very much an issue of politics right today. And I think we've got to consider the issue of politics in here. The issue of gas and the price of gas is one issue in terms of decision of the level of influence of world powers in different countries, and one of them is across Europe. The issue right now, for example, even with NATO, is still the issue of what would happen with regards to the role of Europe. China does not use as much gas and relies more on oil. US, to a larger extent, relies more on oil rather than gas, whereas the issue of gas is more of an issue of Europe to a large extent. The question is, if they wanted to actually keep continuing to use gas as a source of energy, then there are views that you can see based on, even on this table, that they have to either come to some sort of an agreement with Iran and open up the reserves there. Qatar, to a large extent, has already come into the world market, but some of the fields between Iran and Qatar are already shared. A huge investment has taken up in Qatar, and they're actually drawing some of that, but it is not sufficient. The question of the balance politically makes it difficult for them to actually come up to some sort of an agreement with regard to the value of the gas. If they decide to recognize the position of Russia economically, then in that case, they have to recognize the role that Russia has to play. And this is the card that Russia has in its hand. The other alternative, Iran, is not going to be an issue simply because the politics in there doesn't actually make it possible with all of the talks that they have, even on the nuclear issue or under the pretext of the nuclear issue. Based on this, I think if you're looking at the price of gas and changes of the price of gas, the question to a larger extent would be, what would be the recognition of the issue from the point of view of politics? If I just could give you an analogy of this, just imagine for a second, UK was a major supplier of oil like Saudi Arabia. And you can imagine the role of it they would have politically, economically across Europe, and the dependency that it would require or the benefit that it would want to get out of that. This is not the case with regard to the country like Russia. The position, issue with Europe, I think all of that has to be brought into the view in order to see an answer. UK government would not be able to determine the price of the gas, nor Europe alone would be able to determine the price of the gas or lowering of it, irrespective of the absolute correctness that was said in the introduction, that UK decided that the cost of the storage was too high. So during Theresa May's time, they decided to sell off the space of the storage and not keep that because the cost of it was more, and they didn't expect that there would be an issue with regard to Russia. But since recent, over the past few months especially, with the US and Biden trying to push more of the giving a second role to Russia and giving it more of a backseat in terms of the energy, this issue has come to the fore more. And I think this is partially what we're seeing in terms of the gas prices. Sorry, I'll just leave it as that. Thanks.
Very much, man. David.
Well, thanks, Matthew. You did a great job in setting it all out, giving us maps to have a good look at, and backing up with data. It was a really good presentation. It does raise a number of points, and let me just respond a bit to some of Leslie's points. I've visited Denmark in one of its coldest times in the 1980s, and they didn't even have the gas on or any fire on. The house was quite warm. You walked in, you could take your jacket off, which usually you couldn't do in an English home. And being a South African, you're a bit sensitive to the cold. And you hardly needed 2 blankets on the bed. That's because the houses were built for the cold. They actually were really well insulated and a beautiful brickwork, by the way, and so forth. So it's part of the degradation of living stock, that we have these fantastic dependence on energy in summer to keep cool, and in winter, to warm up. But it's just another point in relation to the Norwegian sovereign fund. That's what you were describing. I've a friend of mine who made a study of that in Norway. And it's exactly as you explained. I think an Iraqi engineer, was the person put in charge, and he had nothing but everything to do with it. I mean, if you compare this to the fantastic sums of money that are paid, to people who do special jobs for the state. I think he was just on an ordinary civil servant's salary, and he was handling billions, literally billions and billions of funds, and it was all run. I mean, in South Africa, you just couldn't even think of anything like that. And the idea was that a windfall, that they regarded oil as a windfall. In other words, that it was going to happen and then disappear, and that the investment had to be made in some way for the nation, for all the people of Norway, and that it shouldn't be, any cash should not be brought into Norway, otherwise it'd be hyperinflation. If with all the oil money, racing around at terribly small, it's only a few million people, and so they parked it off, and now I think it's one of the top 3 sovereign funds in the world. I mean, it's fantastic. They could pay for pensions for everybody. I mean, even by drawing only 5% on that. So, that shows, what can we say, some forward thinking of the minuscule capitalist class in Norway, and opposed to the profligate attitude everywhere else, as in South Africa, to when the gold price goes up, the money's spent usually on war. And then when it's the gold price goes down, everyone goes through austerity. With state intervention, intelligent state intervention, socialist policies, we could handle this. But there is a longer term point which Aman has raised, which is that we're dealing with fossil fuels as a whole. And basically, can I say there's been no progress at all, despite all the talk, the blah, blah, blah. There's been no progress. In fact, in the past decade. In fact, every year there's been a rise, apart from during the COVID period where it went down for a period, but now it's roared back again. And now we're in hyper dependence on fossil fuels, which is what every single country of note, has proclaimed, is leading the world, to a catastrophic future. Everybody knows that, and yet every day a decision is made to increase dependence on fossil fuel. And it is what I think Aman also pointed to, the political influence, of the oil sector. It was not for nothing that Trump, came in, and he was one of the staunchest defender of the oil sector, and extended it and wanted to extend it even further. And they pay off. The tragedy of Nigeria, it's unbelievable. The BBC has a program now of the absolute destitution of the areas where oil has been extracted from, and the degradation of the people, and the gangster politics which has resulted from shell oil in that country. We just haven't started to take stock yet of what the political impact of the fossil fuel industry is. And therefore we should be seeing, the world should be seeing this crisis as a huge opportunity to move rapidly to renewables, but actually we're not. We're continuing as before. Just one question, well, a few questions I'd like to throw out to Matthew and then conclude. Matthew, Trump had always pushed the idea that the US could support Europe as opposed to the dependence on Russia. And yet Germany had resolutely opposed that and wanted to increase the dependence on Russia. The Nord Stream project involved a huge investment, which increased the dependence of the EU on Russia at a time when there was already signs that Putin was becoming hyper-aggressive in relation to Georgia and intervening in an imperialist way, in Eastern Europe. And yet they increased the dependence. And I think it was part of an imperialist strategy, a strategy which it had an armed side to it, but it also had another side to it, which is that they wanted to fully integrate Russia into the EU, make it so dependent mutually, so dependent that nobody would think of wanting to break out of that. I mean, it's not for nothing that I think, again, this is a question to you, Matthew. The figure we have is that Europe is 40% dependent on gas on Russia. And I think, that's not an accident. That's a deliberate strategy. They could have gone to Algeria, they could have stepped up Norway and so forth, but instead they decided to bring in Russia into the picture. And I think it draws out some of the ambiguity in different strategies. And we don't have ultra-imperialism, where all capitalist countries are united. Rather, what we have is fragmentation, or not, fragmentation is too strong a word, but different strategies within the imperialist overall strategy, which is Germany to increase dependence and East policy to increase dependence on Russia, to integrate Russia fully into Europe, whereas France is a somewhat, a different strategy. I think I'll stop there. Just the last question on the Nord Stream. I mean, it's an incredible decision because it was regarded by Ukraine as an anti-Ukraine strategy. In other words, that they wanted to have direct relationship with Russia rather than have a pipeline that it comes through Ukraine. I wonder if you could just clarify the politics, of that investment. Thanks. Mm-hmm.
Thanks very much, David. I'll take Dominic and then Ed, and then I think we'll perhaps return to Matthew, who's got a rather list of questions to answer. So, or Dominic or John, whoever wants to speak, would you like to go next?
It's Dominic. I just wanted to relate some of the stuff. When I was working, I used to work for a firm, GEC, in Manchester, and the section I worked in was power generation, and we were making power stations for power turbine generators for the power stations, which were then, ordered by the CEGB. It was all a central network. There was two firms in Britain doing it, Parsons and GEC. They've disappeared now. The whole thing I want to mention, though, was in the 70s. We were working through our Joint Office Committee. We had delegates working with Manchester University about alternative energy, as we were concerned about, at that time, that turbines might go out, particularly coal-fired, and the whole question of alternative fueling in the not immediate future, but in the longer distant future. And we were discussing with them at the time was wind generation and wave generation. I think they called them nodding ducks at the time. And basically they could generate, and that's going back to the 70s. What brought it to mind, I was discussing with somebody last night about computers. And the first computer I got it second-hand, but it had a publishing program on it that had 4 fonts, and you couldn't type into it. And that was in 1990. I got it because of the poll tax and to put out leaflets. And in the 30 years since that, you can see what's happened with computers. The person I was talking with just says my mobile phone's got more power in that than that computer. That computer had then far more power in it. And I think the whole question of nationalisation, not nationalisation, basically the question of the working class democratically taking into its hands the means of production, and centering at the moment on the power industry and what can be done there, and what the argument against wind power is it's not stable, but the way the tide comes in twice a day and goes out twice a day. So there's nothing more stable than that. And that's the area, as far as I can see, that there's been the least research in, because it would affect the power, the coal, oil, and the nuclear lobby, which is the most expensive form of power. And if you took in the waste aspects of that, would actually be ridiculous. The other touch, it's a bit disjointed that from the gas crisis at the moment, but it shows you that at least workers at that time were thinking about the future and what's going on, and the government couldn't give a damn. The other thing I'm confused about is, has the supply of gas actually dropped? Because there's no interest of Russia cutting off the taps at the moment. The sanctions on Russia, but as was mentioned just a minute ago, Germany, which is its biggest customer, is not cutting its supply. It said we're putting on sanctions that hurt Russia but don't hurt us. That's their policy. So they're not doing anything about gas. So I'm just wondering, has the actual supply of gas dropped, and how significantly has it dropped? Or is this just an opportunity by the capitalists to say, there's an increase in demand, we'll corner the market, jack the price up and make a killing? How much of that is in this whole process? I'll leave it at that. Bit disjointed, but there you go.
Hey, thanks, Dominic. Ed, do you want to go next? Then we'll return to Matthew.
Thank you, Pam. This is a question, really. I mean, thanks very much, Matt, for your introduction. And it relates to what Dominic's just been talking about, that you have coal, you have oil, you have nuclear, and yet if you just look at the availability of something like tidal power, it cries out that this is a source of energy that is clean, and once the initial investment is made, it's very, very cost effective. I mean, all you need is equipment and a bit of maintenance. It virtually takes, I mean, apart from maintenance, once the equipment is set up, it virtually takes no work at all to get energy. Now, I'm trying to relate this to Marxist economics. The whole idea of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall is that as industry becomes more sophisticated, there's more and more investment in technology and less investment in human labor. And therefore, there is less scope for generating profit. Now, capitalists, of course, haven't read Marx, and they don't express it like that. But when capitalists say that, well, we can't do tidal investment and wave power and that kind of thing because the initial investment is too great, do they not really mean that the scope for making profits is too limited? Is this not a
an aspect, a manifestation of Marx's theory of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall as technology increases, where you have, a form of power generation that virtually involves no human labor whatsoever. And doesn't this therefore, I mean, isn't this the key explanation for why capitalist investors cling to coal, oil, and nuclear? Because they can see themselves continuing to make profit out of that, and they can't see in a future clean energy production, which is virtually cost-free, they can't see where the scope is for profit. That's it.
Thanks very much, Ed. Matthew, you want to come back and respond to those innumerable questions?
Yeah, not in there. I'll try and get through as much of it as I can. Right, okay, well, there was various people made mention of the Norwegians and their sovereign investment fund. Obviously, clearly, I mean, that was their strategy and still is. I mean, obviously, the strategy of Thatcher was completely different. Was that one to use the money, obviously, to pay off to allow the companies to make make super profits and so on from the North Sea, and also, of course, to pay off the working class that they wanted rid of. I mean, obviously, they had to pay for redundancies, all those miners from something, So the fact you had a lot of money from the North Sea, it was very handy for that sort of thing. So you could pay off, obviously, the working class itself. I mean, clearly a real contrast between the Norwegian sector, in which they actually have, health and safety. I mean, okay, there have been disasters in the Norwegian sector. I mean, I did know of people who were on the Alexander Kielland rig in the 70s, which turned over and killed the entire crew. But I mean, the number of disasters in the British sector has always been far worse. I mean, horrible, and the pay is worse as well. I mean, if you speak to people working in the North Sea, I mean, it's all they want to work in. They certainly want to work for the Norwegians, not the British, because the pay is so much better as well. Not only are you less likely to get killed, you also get paid a lot more money. So it's a different business. I think that the second, in terms of insulation, I mean, clearly, insulation in this country in Britain is a total mess. It's an absolute mess, because clearly, I mean, Britain has the worst insulated in buildings in all Europe, and there's been no real serious effort to rectify that. Or in fact, every time they come up with new standards, of course, the building companies and the government between them manage to destroy them or sabotage them or whatever else. I mean, the only effort really is retro install insulation, which is with the eco scheme, which is run on a peculiar basis, actually, as a levy on electricity bills, actually increasing the price of electricity by nicking money. I mean, this is the problem that we have with governments in Britain, is that they look at this stream of billions and billions of pounds that that pay for the utilities, and what they do is they think, well, we'll have a piece of that, so they do. And so you have all these different schemes in which actually increase the price, particularly of electricity. But the eco scheme, of course, is one of those things which the Tories actually have on several occasions have thought they can get rid of, because obviously it would mean that they can cut the bill cheap. But of course, what it would mean, of course, would be the destruction of that sector of the installation industry, the installers, and so on. It would destroy that whole thing for years if they even interrupted it for a few months. So I mean, this is a real mess and needs to be sorted out. It's very important that something should be done. There should be demands for a proper scheme for insulating. And so you can see, I mean, the Insulate Britain thing is a fair point by that campaign. In terms of looking at fossil fuels and renewables and gas exports and the politics, I mean, the thing is that I think I don't think Russia's an imperialist country. I think obviously it's basically based on the export of primary goods and gangster capitalism. It's not actually imperialist. But it's, I mean, it's true. I mean, clearly, there's a lot of politics in there, and the tie-in between Germany and Russia has been very, very central to that. Going back over 50, 60 years, the development of that whole sector, and that, I mean, clearly there's an effort to maintain fossil fuels, and to use gas actually to supplant coal. I mean, and in the case of Germany, actually nuclear, because the Germans, after Fukushima, the Germans took a decision. There was a huge political outcry. Nuclear's never been particularly popular in Germany anyway. And after the Fukushima disaster in Japan, there was a decision to close all German nuclear facilities, which will be carried out. Is being carried out, and will be completed in the next few years. So actually, then increases the dependency. But the thing is, politically, if you look at it, the way they've done it, it's actually also, I think, a scheme by the Americans. I don't think it's an accident that the Americans are actually campaigning to get Nord Stream 2 shut down or not opened before the war started, because they quite happily stick the bullet into the German economy, as well as the Russians. That to them is a bonus under conditions in which the hegemony of the American ruling class is clearly declining, and they clearly understand that. It makes them extremely dangerous to almost everybody. And they will do things like that. There's no question, absolutely no question of that. If you look at the US, I'll just share my screen again. What I have here, I'm hoping there's, yeah, there you are. No, that one, yes. This here shows you what's been happening in the US in terms of a move to gas itself. It's same as in Europe, and squeeze of coal. You can see actually, of course, the rise in renewables, although not to the degree you've had in some parts of Europe, and the rise in gas, because obviously, particularly based on frack gas, because it's cheap. I mean, essentially, natural gas in the US has been very cheap for a number of years, and still is actually, because obviously they're not affected by this. But this is the bonus they've got. They can put the screw on. They can use this to put the screw on everybody else, the Europeans, the Russians, and it doesn't hit US at all. So for that from their point of view, it's an absolute bonus. From the point of view of the US ruling class, but as I say, there's a squeeze on coal, which is what you want. But really, obviously, the key question is to stop burning stuff to make electricity. It's critical to the world. I did like the piece about the. In terms of turbines and so on and so forth. I mean, I remember, when we used to go around to visit the old coal stations, and the enormous gleaming turbines, obviously built largely by English Electric GC. It's actually very interesting. The effect of the withdrawal of these is actually to make the system itself, the balancing of electricity, much more difficult. Because actually you've got the coal station actually is makes having big lot coal in the system actually makes the system much more easy to manage. What happens when you get a lot of renewables on the system actually is the prices and the control system becomes much more volatile, because stuff comes up and down and all this sort of stuff. And in solar electricity it's like a curve over the sun, over the period where there is sun, so you get maximum generation at 1 o'clock or 12 o'clock. So it's just like this curve, and that's constantly on, and then wind comes up and out, and so that the actual fluctuations on the system are much more. And the thing is also, I mean, even the whole technical mechanical thing is that having these big turbines spinning at huge speed actually, again, itself makes the system much more stable, because you have this what's called an inertial effect, and all that weight spinning at massive speed actually damps down the system. So what they're doing technically now is to try and work out how they can replicate that in order to try and control the frequency on the system such that it actually works as it should do. So technically it becomes an issue. But obviously, there's then been this whole question in terms of the question of wave power. And certainly, I remember the whole business with the Salter duct, Professor Salter, who was at Edinburgh University actually, who devised the first one, and that deliberately targeted actually by the nuclear industry in order to try and destroy it, which they did. I mean, the point was the whole sector's actually said, well, we need to destroy this, and the government has refused over and over again to actually support the development of a wave sector in this country. And I've known people who've worked for different companies attempting to do this, and over and over again, what you get is bankruptcy after bankruptcy because there's no support or no program to run the thing. And so, I mean, really, it shows you actually require planning in order to make these things work. Because without that, it just doesn't work at all. And actually, what you've got is a situation where the sector is essentially is controlled by the state, but with essentially the usual thing, the socialisation of losses and the profits go to various private operations. So I mean, the point would be, I mean, clearly you make the thing to say, well, clearly it makes sense to nationalise the whole thing, but the point being, of course, is it has to be the whole sector and not just bits. I mean, to say to privatise, to nationalise merely supply, just to say, okay, well, everybody, it would just allow for again socialisation of a massive loss, and not, you'd need to take control of the whole system. And redesign the system, and I think that goes into the whole question of profit generation and what you're saying. I mean, what Ed was saying. No, I don't agree. I don't think Ed's right in the point he makes that capitalists don't read Marx. Capitalists clearly do read Marx. Actually, finance capitalists are very. That's the nature of finance capital. It is very conscious of its own position, and there was no question. If you looked at what was written at the crisis of 2007-8, that lots and lots of finance capitalists had read Marx, and they said, "Yes, well, this is obviously in Marx." And you can go back and look at the article; it's in there. They said, "Well, this is clearly Marx." And what could they draw from Marx? And there's no question that a section of these people do read Marx. No question, absolutely no question at all. The point, as I say, being, that what we require for this is planning. Planning is central to the whole business, because obviously you're looking at systems which require, a 40-year time horizon. You're looking at between, design, creation, lifetime of asset and all this, sort of 40 years or more. So you need this long-term planning in order to make this system actually work effectively, and this is the key, I think. So yeah, I mean, it makes a real case in those terms. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Matthew. Anybody else? There's no hands up at the moment. Got plenty of time yet.
Pam?
Yes.
Sorry,
Go
a
on, David.
question.
Yes, fine. Yeah.
Rather than a contribution. Matthew, you made some interesting points about the turbines that you saw, and some points about the necessary further research and development that's needed. I wonder if you could, I just caught a bit of it. Somehow it slipped and not catching it all. But I wonder if you could just expand on that, because that links together other contributions, which show that capitalism basically, apart from it, well, it's governed by the profit system in its various ways, but it's not making the necessary investment in research and development. And now we go through floods and famine. At some time, it seems that we've got too much oil, and then it's squandered. I mean, at one time, the price of oil was zero, and below zero. Unbelievable if that could be. In other words, if you could take it away, they would pay you to take it away. and now it's through the roof. So it goes through these enormous zigzags, which is what compounds the problem of capitalism developing itself. It goes through booms and slumps, which are very concrete booms and slumps. Usually they have a particular reason for a boom and a particular reason for the slump. And then, as it peaks and as it falls, all of these things, come together. But look, I'm just rather to ask a question about what types of research and development would really accelerate the alternative to fossil fuels and would be part of a program that we would want to initiate, to see, the great change in society.
Thanks, David. Any other points before Matthew responds? Felicity, you've got your hand up. Do you want to come back in?
Yeah, please. It's been a really interesting discussion, and thank you to Matthew for the work that you've done in preparing it. And please do not put it into an article that we can share, because people do need to understand it. But there's 2 points I want to look at. One is the very, very practical and immediate thing of people not being able to afford to heat their house and not being able to keep warm, and that we need some kind of social movement around that. We've got food banks if people can't eat, but what the hell do you do when people are just sitting in the cold in their house, or going to bed as soon as they come home from work, because that's the only way you can keep warm. Obviously it's not going to be as bad in the next couple of months, but come September, especially with the additional price rises. I mean, my estimated bill came through that I need to pay 247 a month, and that's before the September rise. And Leslie and I were discussing yesterday the fact that my state pension is actually just over 550. That's like half of your pension. So one of our friends was saying she's just not going to use the central heating from now on. But we know that will make her ill. So what can we do? I mean, I'm just throwing out, has anyone got any thoughts, any suggestions? Back in the 80s, people used to go and strap the meter for you, that actually, make sure you could get your electricity without it being recorded on your meter. I think it's a bit harder to do that these days, and I'm not particularly advocating it, but can we think of any way? And I'm not expecting answers at this moment, but we need a social movement response, and we need some transitional demands on that issue. And then that, as other people have said, it links into the climate crisis. Now, there's thousands of people prepared to go on the streets, and not just on the streets for a couple of hours, but to be arrested, to stay overnight, to stay for weeks if necessary, on the issue of the climate. But this shows more than anything that you can't separate the climate issue from the need to transform society. And the point that Matthew made about these are 40-year projects that are needed. I mean, we ain't going to have 40 years in terms of the climate crisis if we, and the prospect that we're facing is really quite awful. So, I mean, it also is amazingly international. When one of my sons lived in northern Greece, they were building, and part of his work, he got some work from this particular project, was to take a Russian pipeline into Alexandroupoli in northern Greece. And I think that is now operating. But all of this ties everything in together. But the big point I want to think is, in terms of our agitational work and practical social solidarity work, what can we do around this issue?
Thanks, Felicity. In the absence of any hands going up, actually, I'd like to respond to that. I think we're thinking back to the poll tax campaign. We need a mass non-payment campaign. And the Socialist Labour Network's currently got a working group with a view to setting this group up on the basis of can't pay, won't pay. If we cast our mind back to the poll tax campaign, that was hugely effective. The reality is people won't be able to pay the bills this winter. So I think that's what we're looking at. We're looking at a mass popular campaign. I don't know if anybody's got anything to say on that or any comments. Roger. You're muted, Roger. You're muted.
Just to underline what you said, Pam, there has been a lot of discussion on how a campaign can be developed, a can't pay, won't pay campaign, which is literally cannot but be materialized because people literally can't pay, and that means that people literally won't pay, and there will be huge convulsions in society, I think, as a result of that. Now, as Pam said, we're working with this Socialist Labour Network, which is really a very small group of people who are exiles from the Labour Party, if you like. But I know it's been taken up by a number of other groups as well, and I think we need to develop a joint campaign, something like the poll tax campaign in the 80s, which after all did lead to the abolition of the poll tax and to the overthrow of Thatcher. I do think there's going to be, of course, it'll be far more difficult to organise a campaign on this issue, but I think there's going to be such huge convulsions in society, such one way or another, it's going to mean a whole new era in relations, in social relations, and political situation. I'll just also say that, I mean, perhaps Matthew could talk about other possibilities of changing the subject, but other development of energy sources. Ed talked about tidal power. There's also interesting, I know it's, I'm no physicist, but I believe there's been a breakthrough in research into the possibilities of fusion power, which of course could be an absolute, solution to the whole problem, which couldn't be developed, I'm sure, under capitalism because of the huge investment that would be involved. But it does show that it's not a sort of terminal crisis for humanity. It's a crisis of the system. Perhaps Matthew would like to speak more about that.
I also asked if Matthew's speaking about that, if he could say something about this heat exchange system. I live in social housing, and the proposal of the Housing Association is that we'll get rid of our gas boilers, we'll have these heat exchange systems instead. So if Matthew can say something about the effects of them, I'd be very interested in that. Are you ready to come back, Matthew?
Yeah. Okay. Well, questions of all sorts are thrown in this one. Well, I think really, I mean, looking at the starts, in terms of, a technical understanding of how the system actually works, as I say, the sort of investment cycle you're looking at, then I mean, there is that sort of basic sort of engineering question, that you're looking at the management of system, electricity systems and so on and so forth, which I mean are becoming increasingly more difficult because obviously the nature of what's on the system, so that it technically in those terms, but it's then I think the main thing is in terms of planning, and we should be saying, look, you people, because essentially, I mean, all of that investment is essentially guaranteed because it is happening because it's guaranteed by the state. If you look at all the stuff that goes on, nobody really puts a lot of money into the system unless the state is prepared to hold its hand up and say you should do it, and you get some kind of guarantee. So I mean, the thing would be, look, I mean, why is it we have you people if the whole thing's controlled by the state in any case? say that all you've got with the capitalists is they're taking off a chunk off the top, and I think that we should say that. So, in terms of when you're talking about pricing, I mean the similar. You talk about the point where West Texas Intermediate Oil went minus. Which I think was 2020. I can't remember exactly, but the problem was obviously then you've got a negative price for oil in the US for a period. That's happened quite a lot on the electricity system. Actually, as I say, the impact of renewables. Because of the volatility on the system, because of the generation goes up and down and it's difficult to control. What's happened is it goes negative. And that particularly actually it happened in Britain to a degree over the pandemic, because obviously a lot of load came off the system, and what you got was the system was actually running on the back of renewables far more than anything else. Because obviously a lot of companies had shut down their demand, so a lot of generation was off. So the basic generation became renewables, and actually the system went negative pricing in the UK as well, or in Britain on the GB system on a few occasions. Is much more so in Germany actually, because they've got a lot more renewables on the system, and actually what it did was to destroy the balance sheets of all the big German generators got completely flattened by this. So what they did was then to hive off their generation arms. They could try and limit the damage. And you've got the situation, say, particularly the likes of, if you look at, say, RWE, for instance, bought this Dutch company, Essend, they bought it, I think it cost them 2 billion euros or something, 2 point something billion, and they had to write the whole thing off. Because they actually got the situation, they had a brand new gas power station in Holland, and they shut the thing because they weren't making it wasn't making any money. It couldn't make any money on the system. So it's these things are happening all over. But it's a lack of planning. And there's sort of anarchy of capitalism compared to what's actually required, and this is the central point. And I think that the key really in terms of the development of the electricity system, really in those terms is one actually, it's decentralization. I mean, now you've got a position where people can actually go and generate themselves with the ability of solar, with the availability of solar PV and small wind. You can go and generate your own. And what you've also got is the ability to control local network. I mean, there's no reason why you couldn't have a city that controls its own or even a district that controls its own network, because this is now technically, in terms of the software and so on and so forth, quite available and quite easy to do. So you could have local community control of the electricity network. But also, the thing about solar, of course, is it's as solar panels become cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. If you can actually sort of sit solar on top of batteries, what that does is the ability to generate. You can take all the power whenever the sun's available and store it. And use it when you require, and especially in terms of where there isn't an electricity network, that's really quite liberating. To be able to say, okay, you can go to a village or whatever else that doesn't have an electricity supply that you can put in panels and batteries, and you can say, well, you can have power 24 hours a day. On the basis of a system which is not hugely expensive. I think that the key. The problem is, of course, as you say, in terms of building a social movement, in terms of house on end. I think it's now it's clearly understood, and that by as I say, the bosses of the energy companies who went to Parliament, and what I'll try and do is I'll try and cut that. It'll be on there in terms of a recording and so on and so forth, and we should maybe circulate it. But they quite clearly understand that the problem that we're going to the situation we're in at the moment, of course, is that they can generate bills, but they understand that people won't be able to pay these things. And that actually what you're looking at is a situation where the companies are going to get are literally going to get squeezed to death, because they're going to be supplying power and they won't be able to collect any money for it. And they understand this is an extreme political issue. Because the working class doesn't have the money. And therefore, I mean, really, it becomes a question of saying, look, you know, to all the politicians, look, you know, this, we can't pay this. We can't pay. You know, it doesn't matter what you know, because the price will go up again in Britain. The price cap will go up again to probably the best part of £3,000 a year in October. But we can't. You know, we're not paying it, and there should be a right to everybody to be on supply. And the question is, there has to be a political solution to this. You know. Whatever that is, or that's a problem, you know, and what it will say, what it will do is it will just cut the whole system to bits. There's no question that's what's going to happen. A bit unfortunate for those of us who work in it, but that is what is going to happen. And the question will be, well, what is the political solution to that? You know, in terms of people's right to an energy supply. I mean, what we're also going to see, of course, is people, as you say, people are going to turn off their gas and start cutting down trees and burning all sorts of stuff. And we have to say, well, you know, obviously this is regressive. We're against that sort of thing. But you know, the more resourceful parts of the working class will do that. And we have to say, well, you know, there has to be a political solution to this issue. And I think that in terms of energy sources, I mean, the problem is, I think with fusion power will be a while off. But as I say, I think you've now got a situation where, you know, you can have control of a more decentralized system. So you can have community control of energy, particularly electricity. Actually, you can generate your own, you control networks. You know, these things can be done, and it's only the lack of political will that they're not being done.
Okay, thanks, Matthew. I think one thing I think we have to consider is the question of insulation as well, of insulation and the large scale installation of solar panels. So you sort of, you know, you're kind of attacking the problem from an environmental thing, but not by you know, blocking the M25, which essentially didn't really work. But maybe we need to have an insulation campaign as part of the can't pay, won't pay campaign. And certainly, you know, the subsidised installation. Nearly everybody has a roof of some description. Everybody should have solar panels if they want them.
Just come back on it, because that was the other thing you point. Your other point was in terms of heat networks. I mean, obviously these things are important, and we should be in favour of them. But at the moment, the problem is, what's the price? You know, at the moment, as has been pointed out, there's no actual price regulation on it. So whoever controls the network can charge you whatever the hell they like. You know, so the question is then okay, you know, is there a price for a heat network? You know, who controls it becomes critical. You know, if you've got a group, you know, if you've got, you know, a housing association or whatever else, and they've got a heat network, you know, who, you know, is it just so that they can rip off the tenants? Is it, you know, there to provide a service? It becomes a question of control, and how is the price set? You know, these are again a very, very political point, but these things are critical in terms of, okay, you know, can you recover heat? I mean, you can use heat, you know, what we call waste heat from whatever, and recycle that. You can recover geothermal heat, which I think they're doing in various parts of Britain, but lots in other parts of the world as well. You know, you can recover heat from all sorts of places. You know. So it then becomes, okay, well, you know, we want a heat network, but who controls it and what's the price?
Okay, thanks, Matthew. I can't see any other hands up at the moment. Does anybody else want to say anything else? Ed.
Yeah, I just wanted to raise a question about this sort of can't pay, won't pay approach. Obviously, that's got to be part of what is coming, because people can't pay. In the poll tax campaign, can't pay, won't pay was quite easy to initiate, because everyone was given a bill and the onus was on them to go out wherever it was in those days, to the post office or whatever, and pay the bill. So it was very, very easy to get everybody on side with that, because they had to hold back from doing something that they didn't want to do anyway. With bills today, it's not like that. And I think perhaps, I mean, Finn's here and Jimmy's here, that wasn't there in Ireland about 10 years ago, wasn't there a thing about water charges? And communities had to defend themselves from having their water cut off because people weren't paying the bills. And it involved, you know, whole street loads of people coming out and driving away, you know, these bailiffs or engineer types who had come to cut off the supplies. And I think if we're on this issue of sort of energy supply to homes, it's going to be far more like that. You know, it would involve the bringing of a kind of organized community force together to defend the poorest homes in the street from being cut off by people who come to you know, represent the companies who are trying to screw money out of people who can't afford it. So it, you know, it takes on a different character. It's got the different issues with potentially far more scope for bringing the community together in an act of defiance.
Thanks, Ed. I mean, my understanding is, in certain circumstances, they can't turn your power off old people and young children. So if that's the correct, that the basis of it, you can't turn them off anyway, and they certainly can't afford to pay for their power. Is there anybody else? Okay, do you want to say a final? Oh,
So,
Roger.
Can I just say, just for the benefit of the British comrades who are here, there will be a meeting on Tuesday week of the Shadow CLPs section of the Socialist Labour Network, precisely with an update from the working group, which is planning the can't pay, won't pay activities. So I think all the comrades are on the mailing list for that, but I just wanted to remind them. It's the 3rd of May.
Okay, thanks, Roger. Right, there don't seem to be other hands up. I don't know where Matthew wants to sum up for a few minutes. One thing I've noticed, we've got Hannah with us now. So if we've got time, I wonder if Hannah, if you'd like to just give us a bit of an update, would that be okay? Because I think we've got a bit of spare time. Yeah, you're actually muted, so I can't hear you.
Update is that
well, don't do it just yet. I'm just asking if you want to do one, because I'm just going to finish this discussion. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
You will do great. We'll just make sure we
finish.
finish.
Okay with that.
Yes, fine. Yeah, no,
well,
you've got them. Yeah, if you just hold on a minute, just finish this subject, and then I'll call you back in. Thanks, Hannah.
Of course, yeah.
Okay. Is there anything else then on this subject? Or Matthew, do you want to say anything else before I ask Hannah to come in and update us?
Just a couple of things.
Okay.
I mean, I think essentially in terms of the can't pay, won't pay, as I say, the energy companies understand they're onto a dead loss on this one, because I mean, ultimately, you see, I mean, what you're looking at is that they're saying, okay, well, they understand that the whole business is going to cost them hundreds of millions of pounds. You know, because essentially, as I say, they're going to not be able to collect. And they're already saying, look, there's thousands of customers saying to us, look, we cannot pay these bills. This is happening now, as you would expect. And it's only going to get worse. And the problem is, you know, for them is, okay, well, you know, under the conditions in which, okay, they're not making any, they've been making losses for the last 3 years because of the institution of price cap by Ofgem. Actually, Ofgem, the regulator, actually was forced out of them that actually the allowed margin effectively for most of the companies was -1%. So essentially, none of the companies have been making. I think bar one company. I think one company has been in a very fortunate position of having a very odd contract for its energy purchase, but by mistake somebody else. And everybody else is essentially all the other major suppliers have not made any money out of it for 3 years. And the notion, I think the notion that this is the problem they've got. So, okay, are we going to pay for bands of people to go around and cutting people off? I can't see them doing it. Politically, it would be suicide, and they haven't got any money anyway. What's in it for them? This is the problem they've got. I think this is why they were pleading with the government. Do something. Because we're up against it here. The whole damn system is falling to bits. Clearly also, the other thing, of course, is the situation where, when the Ofgem actually did the regulator says, well, okay, well, you've got a margin of 1%, but what they do, of course, is sack people. And get rid of the workforce, which is the major cost that they can cut, which is why you get fire and rehire at British Gas, for instance. And I know, of course, redundancies, whole redundancy programs and all the rest of it, going through the industry. Actually, crazy enough, under conditions in which the industry is changing like never before, it actually requires all that experienced workforce to carry these out, like smart meters, like the change in the way the whole thing works. And the fact that it actually sort of spends its time getting rid of its more skilled and experienced workforce is actually counter to rationality, but they are, it's capitalism for you, and we should make that point. I think the other thing I'll just go back to is the whole position of Ukraine, because and Nord Stream. Nord Stream was designed, of course, to be a direct route from Germany from Russia to Germany, bypassing Ukraine. Because the problem is, of course, the Ukrainian oligarchs are not particularly honest people. And they spent their time, A, nicking the gas out of the pipeline, and B, charging extra for the use of the pipeline. And the Russians got really fed up with this. The likes of Thatcher and these people. And of course, Biden's family were in on this whole thing in terms of Hunter Biden, his son. He was in on with the Ukrainian oligarchs in pillaging the gas revenues out of the gas pipelines, which is one of the things Russians were very keen to avoid. If there's any money going about, they'd rather have it themselves rather than pay a bunch of pilfering Ukrainians. The thing is, the next point that's actually going to be the issue, of course, is that how do the Russians get paid? And this is why, the problem being, of course, is that now that the Americans have basically attempted to shut down the Russians' access to the world banking system, and so on and so forth, and of course, has staged a major piece of theft by attempting by nicking essentially the Russians' reserves, which is like hundreds of billions of dollars. The problem is the Russians have then turned around and said to the Germans, look, we want to be paid in rubles, because obviously they can't use dollars under those conditions. They need rubles. So they're saying that will be the next question. Well, if the Germans want to keep on paying for the gas, what do they pay for it in? Will it be accepted by Russia under conditions in which dollars become a real serious issue? The thing is, this is then obviously becomes a question of in terms of the imperialist control of the world, and becomes this becomes an issue in terms of who controls countries' actual assets. We've seen the Americans summarily remove all the reserves of Afghanistan and attempt to starve the entire population of Afghanistan. And then now they attempt to do the same in Russia. It's an effort to sort of redivide the world again to suit a declining and desperate US imperialism. It's a bizarre situation and a very, very dangerous one. And we have to sort of try and both in terms of understand all the dynamics in terms of what should a socialist system look like in these terms in running that whole energy system, and at the same time trying to understand, you know, the sort of the impact of what is being done by US imperialism in particular, and how it can be combated. It's a sort of it's a dual thing, but I think under the conditions in which we're going to see, you know, a mass revolt. There's no question there's going to be a revolt, by both by the working class in general, because its wages are being squeezed, and we've seen, you know, the pronouncements of Jerome Powell, who's the head of the Fed, deliberately and seriously targeted the working class. The working class must pay, and we must hold down wages. As then of course echoed by his underling in the Bank of England. You know, we need to hold down wages. You know, and the questions are to break that, and then to say, well, okay, well, at the same time, people have a right to decent housing and the right to heat and light their houses, because otherwise it becomes ridiculous. Thanks. Thanks
very much, Matthew. That was a really excellent lead off. Thank you. Thank you to Matthew and everybody else for their contributions. My suggestion, actually, Roger, just send the details of the can't pay, won't pay meetings around with the next win mailing, and just urge as many people as possible to try come along and get involved if you can. But yeah, thanks for a really good discussion, really thorough and really informative discussion. So we've got we're just going to move on. Hannah's joined us now. Hannah's going to come and give us a brief report on the situation in Belarus. Well, in quite how to describe it, Russia and nearby, and hopefully there'll be time to ask a few questions before the meeting ends. Do you want to go ahead, Hannah?
Yeah, thank you. The situation, well, nothing really changes. We still don't know about some of the people. We couldn't reach them, so we don't know if they were arrested or they weren't, because there's absolutely no information about some of the activists. Those who were initially detained for 3 days, they were kept in prison for reasons unknown. They just kept there. They just don't release them, and they don't charge them as of just yet. What we know is that the most likely, for at least for Gennady, that would be extremist charges. They're probably trying to find anything they can make as a terrorist charge, because the independent unions were quite openly anti-war. That probably be the treason charges on top of that, but we just don't know just yet. Those who were released after questioning, they say they were basically, the KGB was fishing, trying to get anything that could be interpreted as high treason. So that's what's happening at the moment. So we're still waiting for those arrested to be formally charged. I mean, normally, under normal process, if a person is not charged after 72 hours, they're released. But I mean, in Belarus, some people just stay in prison without any formal charges until they actually decide what to charge them with.
Thanks, Hannah. Does anybody wants to ask Hannah any questions or make any comments? I'm sure somebody must. David.
Yeah, well, just to update comrades on a discussion we had on Saturday, and thanks for the comrades getting together in a kind of emergency session at short notice. The point is that REP is the only union I've now found which has been declared extremist. The others are apparently not. In other words, the focus is on REP. And REP is the backbone, really, of the independent trade unions. You'll have seen previously we've had postings about, you know, some misconceptions sometime among the other unions. Others have been detained, as Hannah said. We're not too sure what's happened. But Hannah, I'm just opening your list now of all the comrades in REP who've been detained. We know that there's the comrade, I think her name is Daria. I always get it a little bit wrong, or Dana. She's house arrested in Brest. For some reason, they seem to want to really smash REP completely in Brest. But the point about the extremist organization is that any activity being a member of REP is now a 6-year potential sentence. I mean, it's that bad. In other words, they're trying to completely dismantle, demolish, and utterly throw to the winds. This organization, which has been part of our, which is part of our network and has participated very actively at times in our network. So, comrades, we need to do everything we can. And what we have, just to sum up some points, sorry, Hannah, then I'll stop.
Right.
Ed has said that it's possible to get in touch with some Labour MPs. The latest information we're getting, Ed, should beef up, strengthen that point, particularly that the extremist organization and the penalties for being in REP trade union. And then we've got opportunities with Jimmy and maybe Finn taking out the issue to the Irish comrades, Irish Labour movement. And then the opportunities we have to knock at the top as well as at the bottom. We push from below, and also, I think Hannah and I will be sending emails out to quite a wide range of unions, to make sure that the particular plight, the particular attack on REP is repulsed, and that we get Gennady out. Gennady is in poor health, and they could imagine being in a KGB cell over this weekend. It's tough in the extreme. Hannah, do you want to add some more?
Yeah,
can I just bring Felicity in next and then come back to you, Hannah, because Felicity might want to ask you something as well.
I just wanted to express the solidarity and say if there's anything we can do, either through the European left or anything like that, please let us know. More than happy to make sure that's raised, with the Brussels office and with the president and all the rest of it. If you let me know what you want me to say.
Well, we will be very grateful, because right now I tried speaking to people in the IUF and asking them what can be done, because before Gennady was arrested, we were trying to put together a campaign to basically, with the aim of suspending Belarus membership in the ILO or whatever other sanctions there could be that could pressurize Lukashenko enough to release the activists, because Zinaida Mikhnuk from Brest, she was a branch leader, she's still arrested. They haven't charged her for, she's been in there for almost a month, and they haven't even charged her. So then I spoke to them. They say, oh, well, we think that it's Industrial is dealing with the ILO and they need no help. They know what they're doing. So basically sit tight. Well, so far, there was nothing from Industrial, and the ILO hasn't released any statement. Well, they had the general statement, but there's no movement from them. So, and the longer they drag the issue, the longer the comrades stayed arrested. And so I think we must do something, because, I'm very happy to speak to anyone directly who wants to sort of clarify that. But the attack on REP is because REP union is the largest of all the independent unions, and it had the biggest outreach, had 28 branches all over the country, and was most active, and had the most programs, and people were actively joining. So right now, what we're thinking is that what's happening in Belarus, it may be, some people believe that it may be the case that Lukashenko just simply has nowhere to go, and that the new Russian ambassador to Belarus, he spoke a lot about deepening of the integration. So basically, it's probably he's showing that he's happy to sort of get rid of the last opposition, because there was no real opposition in Belarus but the independent unions. I mean, the whatever Tikhanovskaya's office in Vilnius is saying, but in reality, they had absolutely no influence in the country, because they are outside. They could only appeal to people for, say, when the war in Ukraine started, they appealed to people for a all country strike. Well, there were about 800 people actually responded to that. So considering Belarus is 10 million, then obviously that's the outreach they had. But when the union started pushing, people in the factories started to be to show more awareness of what's going on, and some enterprises, people refused to repair Russian military vehicles. There was a lot of work on the railways. The workers tried to sabotage trains going to Ukraine and so on, and that was the union work. So there is a possibility that Lukashenko's basically decided, well, we're going deeper with the integration because he has nowhere to go. And so he's basically preventatively detaining and arresting people who he thinks may be a problem. And with Gennady, Gennady is his personal enemy since the 90s. So that's how that's what he does.
Okay, thanks, Hannah. I'm just going to ask Ed to make his points, and then you may wish to respond to that, but I want to start drawing the meeting to a close now so that Roger can talk about the meeting for next week. Ed, do you want to come in next?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to let comrades know that I have raised this with Ian Lavery's office, that's the MP for this area, Wansbeck in the north of England. And I've also raised it with Jamie Driscoll's office. Jamie is the Mayor of Tyneside. They've both been helpful on this issue in the past. And I mean, I haven't directly heard back from them, but I'm pretty sure that by early in the week that I will hear from them, and that they will do something about, sending messages of support and so on. And I've suggested to Ian Lavery that he actually puts down an early day motion in Parliament about it. I don't know if that will materialise, but it's a suggestion anyway.
Okay. Thanks, Ed. Jimmy, is it a quick point?
Yeah, it's a point that I wanted to just raise with British comrades. Unite is, in common with a lot of the British unions, a member of the European Congress or European Trade Union Confederation. The leadership of that confederation, in the personality of Sharon Burrow, has come out condemning the situation in Belarus and calling for support for REP and the other, for the Free Trade Union grouping. What I would ask the British comrades to do is locally or nationally or both contact particularly people in Unite to raise that particular question of solidarity with REP. The argument is that Unite has access to the global power trade unions, which is the international organization of electrical trade unions, of which REP has been invited to membership. So if the international unions could be roused, and Rolf could also take this on board for the Danish unions, where the leader, the leading spokesman for the Global Power Union is a Dane who is actually due for retirement shortly, so we weren't getting into him early. But there's other unions out there too that are wide open for contact, for solidarity support. So the only thing is that time is a vital factor in this situation. So I would ask locally or nationally, put the pressure on. That's all I'd ask.
That's great. Thanks for that, Jimmy. don't know if Hannah just wants a very quick last word before we ask Roger to tell us about next week's meeting. Is Hannah still there? Do you want to come back in quickly, Hannah, or have you done? We're obviously going to have another meeting about this.
Okay. Well, all I can say is that I will be grateful for. Sorry.
Do you want to carry on speaking, or you? We don't mind about the child. We don't just say that, right? Yeah.
Sorry about.
Don't worry about that. Doesn't matter.
So basically, the problem is that so far, all the sanctions that were introduced against Belarus, they didn't move a thing, because Lukashenko, I think he knows there's nothing.
Hannah, just keep going. It's okay. Don't worry about it. Do you want to finish off? You do it. Just don't worry about it. Just carry on talking. Keep going. Keep going.
Basically, so far nothing moves Lukashenko, and he's in the corner. But there was in 2012 when there was another wave of repression against the union. There was a particular threat for Belarus. It was all unofficial, but it was basically let know that if he continues, then Belarus will be kicked out of the ILO. And then at that time, that worked. I'm not sure that it's going to work now because the situation has changed. And that he basically, by all this, he's basically signaling that he is with Putin, and he is basically putting pressure on the last remaining big opposition within the country. Because ILO is a tripartite organization, it's great if the unions will put pressure on it, but also I think we need support from the state. And in the UK, the people from diaspora who I'm in contact with tried getting to government. So far, they got nowhere, and British government never condemned any of that. So maybe they're too preoccupied with the war with Ukraine, maybe for another reason. I don't know.
Having trouble hearing you, Hannah. Actually, your bandwidth's gone very. You're having trouble with your bandwidth. You've gone very, very quiet.
So if there is any possibility to push on the ILO, that they actually consider that, or maybe there is any other way to push on Lukashenko to have people released, it would be great, because I mean, with Gennady, he is definitely not in the best of health, because I mean, he's a cancer survivor, and so I don't know what KP prison is going to do to him, and we just
Hannah, I think I'm going to have to stop you actually, because your signal's now so slow we can't actually tell what you're saying. So thanks very much for coming into the meeting and updating us. You know, I'm sure everybody in Win offers you our full support, and comrades will do what they can to follow the measures up that that have been suggested by the various comrades. Okay, so thanks for coming. We'll see you soon, and we obviously will need to have another discussion about this fairly soon. Thanks very much. Okay, so Roger, can I just turn to you for details of next week's meeting now, please?
Yes, as comrades know, today is quite a major event in Europe. It's the French presidential election, and whichever of the two candidates wins, I think we can be sure that there's going to be intensified turmoil in France after today. And we're very lucky that we have comrades who are right on the spot. Our French comrades will be giving their survey of the situation, their perspectives for the future. So I think that's going to be a really important meeting, and I hope that all the comrades will come and encourage others to come also.
Okay, thanks, Roger. Well, just to remind comrades, if you do want to watch the meeting again, it will be put on the YouTube channel sometime this evening. The link to the YouTube channel is in the email that Roger sent you out for the meeting. So please come on, please subscribe to the YouTube channel because we don't very much. We've set it up fairly recently, and we don't have a lot of subscribers at the moment. So even if you just come on and watch a couple and subscribe, it shows some support for the channel. Okay. Okay, well, with that, thanks everybody for attending the meeting. Hope to see you next week, and I declare the meeting closed.